Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Neil Anderson to talk about winter hardiness in perennial flax. Flax is an important crop worldwide for its many uses, but as with all plants, its global use is limited by the conditions in which it can grow. Enter Neil Anderson, a crop breeder focused on improving many breeding characteristics in flax, including winter hardiness. In this episode, Neil joins us to discuss his work using controlled freezing experiments to test the winter hardiness of flax. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we wanted to thank our sponsor, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today we have Neil Anderson with us. Professor Neil Anderson is a plant nerd. Since his early childhood in Vermont, he has always been interested in plants, horticulture, and identifying plants by their scientific names. He started crossing flowers when he was 5 years old and recording winter survival of wild species in the forest. Neil followed his passion in college with a bachelor's degree in ornamental horticulture from California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. This was followed by master's and PhD degrees in horticulture and plant breeding at the University of Minnesota. After being a postdoc and teaching classes across the horticulture discipline, he worked at Pan American Seed Company and Ball Horticulture Companies as a potted plant production manager, flower breeder, and new crop specialist. He has collected many wild species across the globe for research and development as new products for the ornamental, edible food, and fiber markets. Currently, as a professor and interim department head of the Department of Horticultural Science of University of Minnesota, Neil directs several plant breeding programs, including Perennial Flax, which is the topic of discussion for today. Hi, Neil. How are you doing today?
Good morning, everyone. I'm doing great. It's a lovely sunny day here. Happy spring.
Yeah, well, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show today. So, as mentioned in your bio, we will be talking about flax. So, before we get into the research portion, I thought it would be helpful to just help listeners who are not super familiar with flax kind of understand what it is, what it looks like, what people use it for. I know you mentioned multiple uses in your paper. So, what's going on with flax?
Well, flax is an ancient crop, and what's been grown historically for thousands of years is annual flax. And that species has been used for a wide variety of products, from oil seed that you can eat just directly. You probably maybe have had flax seed in muffins or bread or something like that. So they're high in alpha linoleic acid and full of other good nutraceuticals, if you will, that give you lots of health benefits. Flax has also been used for fiber. So the tall fibers in the stem all the way down into the roots can be harvested and dried and then treated, and many materials are made out of them. Of course, they're all called linen. So if you've ever had any linen, you know, like it's a really high quality fiber, you know, a beautiful piece of material usually. But linen was also used as masts on ships. So all those big sailing masts from years ago were all flax. So that's kind of the history of annual flax. And we're just trying to work with perennial flax, which looks similar to annual. And what's so exciting about it is it has blue flowers. So I've got some here in my pocket, an example of some from our greenhouse. And blue is a rare color in horticulture. So blue flowers are always highly sought for and command a high price on the market. And so we're breeding it for cut flowers as an herbaceous perennial, oilseed, fiber, and then also the potential to use it for pollinators. So ecosystem services is kind of a buzzword these days. And so if we could even harvest flax honey, might it have some of those omega-3s in it and so forth? It would be kind of fun to see. So we're investigating all these possibilities for perennial flax.
Sure. And I think in my mind when I think of what a flax plant looks like, because I didn't look it up, which I probably should have, I just think of like tall grass. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Right. So I happen to have some stems of it here.
Oh, okay.
So you can see that it has very small leaves. So they're like little teeny, about half-inch length in leaves. So it typically grows in the landscape along with other plants. So and it might, when it's in bloom, you'd see it, particularly in the morning, you'd see these nice blue flowers popping up for here and there. But after the petals fall off midday or in the afternoon, then it kind of looks like nothing. You probably wouldn't even see it. So it's fairly inconspicuous in its native habitat, at least. But of course, if you've ever had the option in North Dakota or South Dakota or even in Minnesota, et cetera, or up in Canada, where it's cultivated, you'd see these blue fields of, lovely blue blooming in the mornings, and it's quite stunning.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize the flowers were that short-lived. Are they only there for a day, or how does that?
More like a half day.
A half day.
So they typically, in most plants of flax, they fall off around noon.
Wow.
When the sun gets up higher intensity or a breeze comes up or something, and you get this rain of petals. So there's blue all over the ground in the afternoon. It's actually kind of pretty.
Yeah, that sounds really pretty. So for listeners who obviously did not see what I was able to see just now, it's like a very it's a stem with a bunch of very small leaves and then a very pretty blue flower at a few locations along those stems. How tall does this flax grow?
Well, flax can get anywhere from about knee high to maybe waist high, so maybe upwards of 2 to 3 feet, depending upon what it's been bred for and so forth.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to guesstimate about how high what you showed me was, and then I realized that may not be indicative of the actual full height of the plant, so I didn't want to mislead anybody there. Right. So yeah, now that we have a good understanding of flax in general, I know that this specific paper was dealing with kind of the cold hardiness of perennial flax in general. So I was hoping you could give some information on just kind of broad strokes, how this works for flax, how it acclimates or survives during winter, some of the concerns that were maybe encouraging this type of research at this point in time, and why it's important for, the many uses that you mentioned just recently.
Oh, I'd be happy to. So perennial plants are ones that live more than 1 year in the landscape, and some can be very long-lived, like woody trees and shrubs, and others, such as herbaceous perennials, ones that don't have any woody stems and die back to the ground every fall, usually, to survive the winter. They are ones that are so important in the landscape. And from a commercial standpoint, in your home garden, for instance, you'd love to have a perennial because you don't have to plant it every year. Annuals, serve a very important function as a bedding plant or vegetables, et cetera, in the landscape. But perennials need to be able to survive multiple years and the winter cold. And so since the perennial flax species that we're dealing with, we haven't actually studied how cold tolerant or winter hardy they are to know how far north they could grow or how far south as well. We have to test these things. And usually it's done just in the field. You let them overwinter. If they survive in the spring, yes or no. And then you can select and cross them and get, new potential perennial hybrids out of it. However, in some years, you may remember that we oftentimes don't get snow cover or super cold temperatures. So like I'm in Minnesota at, 45 degrees north latitude, and we'd expect lots of snow cover all winter long, covering the soil and protecting the plants, the perennials underneath, and that we would have very low air temperatures. And of course, the ground freezes as well. So in order to test whether or not something would be perennial, we have to. I give a good example of, let's say, you bought a tree in October or November at the your local greenhouse or garden center, and it was actively growing, had lots of leaves on it, etc. And you said, "Well, it's a hardy plant." I mean, it says on the tag, it's, USDA, whatever, zone 3, zone 4, winter hardy. So I'll just plant it out and it should survive. And then you come back the next spring and it's dead. It's like, oh my gosh, it said it was hardy. What happened? It wasn't acclimated. And so acclimated is a term that refers to how a plant moves its growth cycle to become somewhat dormant from midsummer into fall and early winter, so that it can actually survive the winter and stop producing leaves above ground, and the leaves will fall off like you see fall color in the fall. And so the acclimation process is based on naturally occurring lower temperatures of day and night, as well as a decrease in the day length. Because you probably remember that days get shorter in the winter and longer in the summer. We all love summer, right, for long days. But in the fall, they're very short days. And that temperature and the day length are important cues for plants to acclimate. And so once they're acclimated, then they should be able to survive the winter if they're perennial and winter hardy.
Sure. So then you were kind of trying to incorporate that acclimation process into your testing. You weren't just throwing little seedlings out to the winds and seeing how they survived.
Right.
My guess would be not very well. So obviously you had a much better method to test the cold hardiness of these plants. So can you tell me just how you went about these tests to find these good varieties for farther north and south type perennial flax?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, sometimes we don't get a nice snow cover and cold temperatures outdoors in the field or in your garden during the winter. And so that effect of global warming and just unpredictable nature of winters means that we usually program things to mimic what happens out in your garden or in the field. And so what we do is we take plants, maybe it's cuttings, maybe it's seedlings or mature plants. We'll grow them in the greenhouse. Maybe they've been in the field all summer and we dig them up, pot them up, and then put them in the greenhouse. And we'll slowly drop the temperature in the greenhouse. So the day and night temperature drop. And we also shorten the day length because we can control it with artificial lighting. And that will allow the plants that were actively growing to then become acclimated before doing freezing tests.
Sure. And so when you're doing this test, obviously you mentioned some of the unpredictability that we have had recently or just might have from year to year. So are you incorporating that into your acclimation process where some just have, not necessarily like a freeze-thaw cycle, but kind of that more uneven process? Or at this stage, are you just like, let's just see if they can make it under normal, quote-unquote, conditions, and then maybe expand into that? Or how does that factor in?
That's a good question. So in science, when we're conducting experiments and testing a hypothesis that we want to use to see whether or not, some treatment or factor exists with a plant, we typically use as few factors as possible. And so what we would typically do then is use our known test temperatures to freeze them down to just to get a feel for what is the range of winter hardiness and survival. And then if we chose to, we could do follow-up studies, and then we could zero in on different temperatures or see, does this survive up to the Arctic Circle or way down to southern Florida or places like that. So those would be done in a series of subsequent experiments.
Okay. So then in this particular test, you were running many kinds of flax. And so can you tell me just a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of what flax you were testing, what kinds of temperatures you were looking at, and just more about that process?
Oh, absolutely. So our research conducted involved the three major perennial plants, flax species. There's actually more we've discovered as time has gone on, but the three perennial flax species that are the best known, all of which usually have blue flowers, are Linum. That's the genus for flax, Linum, Linum peren. So that's commonly known as either blue flax or perennial flax, and that's native to Europe. Another perennial species is Linum austriacum, and this is known as Asian flax. And then the third one is one that's native to North America, Linum lewisii. And that particular one is named after that famous Lewis and Clark explorer, Meriwether Lewis. So those are the three main ones that we tested, although we tested an additional set of other flax species. Too long of a list probably to read off to you, but you can of course look at it in the paper that we have. So that's kind of the range of different types of flax species that we used. And
Sure.
I'm sorry, I forget your second question.
Oh, I was just curious about more of the testing process of what temperatures that you were dealing with,
right.
Stuff like that.
Yes, right, exactly. Good question. So maybe you have heard of the U.S. Department of Agriculture or USDA's winter hardiness zone map. Like if you're a master gardener, I bet you've probably heard of it. And oftentimes there'll be a zone number on plants. And this is depending upon the latitude that you're growing in. It will have a USDA winter hardiness zone number. And so like here in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, we're in USDA zone 4. So on a label, if you got a plant that's hardy to that temperature, it would say probably USDA's Z4. And okay, this will grow in my area. If you're further north, up in Canada or northern Minnesota, North Dakota, etc., you're probably in USDA zone 3. And so they have less plants available that are perennial and survive the winters. So again, those would be labeled with a USDA Z3 on the plant label. So you'd know that it should be hardy, if you're up in Grand Rapids, Minnesota or further north. So it should be able to survive for you. And our setup for testing these, so we grow them in the fields and grow them for several years to see, if they survive or not. But as I mentioned, of course, we may or may not get snow cover or super cold winters, because we like good test winters as plant breeders down to, at least minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, if not minus 40 even, and lots of snow cover. The more the better, because that adds insulation value. So we do those tests, but in the off chance that we don't have a good winter, then we do what we call laboratory freezing, where we have these big programmable freezers that we can move pots of acclimated flax into, and then we can program it to drop down to various temperatures, and we can hold it there for so many hours and then pull samples out and slowly thaw them out and let them regrow and see whether or not they're alive. And our test temperatures that we test them at are critical. And so what has been determined based on years worth of scientific research with perennials, and that would be woody trees and shrubs, as well as herbaceous perennials, that there's critical test temperatures that you want to freeze them to in order to determine whether they're USDA Zone 4 or USDA Zone 3 or USDA Zone 5 or 6 winter hardiness. And so those are set temperatures that have been determined and hold true for all perennial plants. And in this case, of course, we're looking at the crown and the root system below. And so, like, as an example, in USDA Zone 4, we test to minus 10 degrees Celsius, which is basically 14 degrees Fahrenheit. So if we can get at least half of the population of plants to survive down to 14 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 10 degrees Celsius, then we would say that that is USDA Zone 4 winter hardy. And then the temperatures drop off lower the further north you go. So like in USDA Zone 3, it would be minus 12 degrees centigrade, which is like about 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the procedure that we use in a nutshell to be able to predictably or reliably test for cold hardiness or winter survival.
Sure. I have a couple of questions off of that. So my first one is, how are you able to or not able to account for like snow cover in these freezers? Is it just we're assuming there's no snow cover, or can you kind of fake that somehow? How does that work?
Yes, that's a good question. Actually, we actually don't use or think about needing to have snow cover in the laboratory freezing tests, because here's the thing, is that in the freezer, when we set it to a set temperature, the entire freezer will get to that temperature. So it means the air temperature and the soil temperature in the containers where the flax are planted is going to be one and the same. Whereas outdoors in the field or in your garden, you know very well that the soil temperature stays fairly uniform. I mean, it freezes here in Minnesota, at least, we have a frost depth of 6 feet. But we have air temperature, however, that can go to anywhere, minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, or even lower. And so snow cover is what protects the soil and the root systems from going that low, because we would never want to have the root temperatures as low as those wickedly low air temperatures, because nothing could survive it, kill everything. So that's why snow cover is important outdoors, but we don't need to have it in laboratory freezing tests.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so
Isn't that
then
cool?
Yeah, that's very cool. I'm learning so much. I love that. So my other question is related to that, and maybe you've partially answered it already, but I'm still missing a piece. How quickly are you dropping these temperatures? Because are you trying to maybe mimic like a flash freeze? Because obviously the air temperature can vary extremely wildly. Being a Wisconsinite, neighbor, I understand the Midwest conundrum of, 40 one day and negative 20 the next. So are you trying to mimic any of that, or is it just, we just drop it at a steady rate and it's similar to the acclimation process where, it's not going to be too fast, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it can have definitely an impact on what the results are when it comes to being able to survive or not to certain temperatures. So oftentimes what we do is preliminary studies to see how quickly we can drop temperatures. So we oftentimes drop temperatures, like we'll start the freezing test. The freezer will be set to a positive number, so it's maybe 4 degrees Celsius or between 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, and the plants will have been in a refrigerator, cooler, at that temperature. So we move them in insulated boxes to get them into the freezer, so everything's at the same temperature. And then we slowly will drop the temperature. And it could be over the course of many hours or days, or it can be fairly quickly. It might be within, say, 5 or 6 hours or 10 hours or something like that. And the rate at which we drop that temperature, so like we'd drop it then from, say it was at 4 degrees Celsius, and we'd drop it to 0, where freezing occurs. Actually, freezing occurs just below 0, but and that can take some time to happen. Ice crystals form and all those kinds of things, and the depth of the soil, the container, can impact how slowly the core of the soil in there gets to the set air temperature. So we put in little temperature sensors or thermocouples that will record the temperature every so minutes or hours, and it feeds to an automatic receiver, so we can see when exactly the center part of that pot reaches the desired air temperature. And when it reaches that, then we'll let it sit there, and we call it soak, if you will, for several hours, usually at least 10 hours, but it could be days as well. And then at the end of that soak period, we could pull samples out and say, like, at 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit at freezing, X number of plants survived or died. And so that duration of dropping the temperature and holding it or soaking it over time all has to be predetermined. And it differs for every single species you deal with. So we have to develop a very specific protocol for every single plant. And of course, we had to do that then for flax as well.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Neil's paper, Controlled Freezing Studies as a Corollary Selection Method for Winter Hardiness and Perennial Flax, published in Crop Science, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Thanks again also to our sponsor, Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Listen to their new podcast, We Measure the World, to hear how innovative researchers leverage environmental data to make our world a better and more sustainable place at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Sure. Yeah. Well, obviously, a ton of thought goes into that entire process, I'm sure, as you switch from species to species and what you're testing. So I will avoid the very, very deep rabbit hole that I'm sure that could be, and
that one can go into, yes.
and keep us moving here. So, what then, after all of that thinking and considering and testing, were your results?
Okay, so yes, that's of course the most important thing, is to see, amongst all the species we tested or the various plants within a population and so forth, to see how many things survived at various temperatures. And so As far as results went, we had some that survived really well at the set temperatures of for USDA zones 3 or 4, but not all of them. So some were better than others, and there were, for instance, really big differences between populations of cold tolerance within Linum austriacum and Linum peren. And as a result, that allows us to choose particular plants or species that we can pull out and say, like, okay, this tends to be winter hardy at USDA zone 4. And we'll use that as a parent to cross with another one that's hardy as well. And so, we had a range of responses. So, I mean, some didn't survive at all. Those typically were some of the annual species of flax that we had, or biennial ones, or ones that were just, from a different latitude in their origin. And so we wouldn't expect them necessarily to have any or all of the plants to survive. And others were, 50%, 100%, really, really good winter survival. And so you can get the whole range of responses based on what it is you're testing.
Sure. And how do these results factor into kind of those end use scenarios? Is this something where, we're looking at it from a sense of trying to breed more winter hardy, or just establishing where they grow so that people can, purchase the right thing? What is the end application with this research, I guess?
Yeah, excellent question. So, well, obviously, one obvious thing is that we could put then a USDA hardiness zone on the cultivar variety when it's released. So it's like, yep, this is hardy in USDA zone 4 or zone 5 or 6 or whatever it might be. But we're always interested as plant breeders and developers trying to push the envelope a little further on. So in other words, try to get, if you've got a species that's only hardy, say, to USDA zone 6, down in Chicago, for instance, then, but it has, let's say, some interesting other plant habits. Maybe it's a good fiber, maybe it's a good oil seed with lots of good proteins in it, or high oil content, or maybe it has lovely flowers, like, oh, this is a color, it's not blue, it's, red or yellow or something like that. So, like, gardeners and farmers always have what we call zone envy. So, like, because, we always would really like to grow things that are, grow further south. If, like, if only we could have them, And so, so we try to answer that request of consumers, both, home gardeners as well as, of course, commercial farmers and so forth, to try to breed for hardier and hardier materials that have traits that are of interest and market value.
Sure. Yeah, I was curious because I know that plant breeding can be a very extended process sometimes of, there's so many stages involved, from, finding that this is what we want to make, to let's do some, initial tests and so on and so forth. So I was kind of curious where along that timeline this project was occurring. So it sounds like maybe somewhere a little farther middle-ish area, maybe. So
right.
We've talked then a little bit about where this would move forward. Obviously, the release of some of those cultivars eventually would be one goal. But where else are we going with this research? What's on the horizon for perennial flax and cold hardiness?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question. So we have several grants that are kind of directing our next steps of research. So one of our grants from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is looking at using perennial flax as a cut flower. So we have a graduate student and several undergraduates working on all the protocols needed to bring this as a cut flower to the market. So it's, selecting for things that have really tall stems and flowers at the top, and that hold their petals maybe all day instead of losing them midday, and have intense blue colors, but then also have good vase life. So, and another term for that would be post-harvest life. So once you cut them from the plant, usually when they're showing color, you put them into buckets with preservatives. They go into coolers. They get shipped out in the wholesale flower market, or the farmers markets. And then either retail florists pick them up or consumers directly, and then they put them into floral designs. And then you expect them to last in the floral design for at least a week. Or two if they're like a chrysanthemum or a carnation. And so we do all those tests to see, amongst all the selections we have that we're evaluating, which one can meet all the criteria along every single step of the way. And this, of course, has to happen for virtually any trait that we're looking at. So like our other ones, like an herbaceous perennial in the garden, does it have a nice mounding form, a hemispherical shape that's loaded with flowers, perhaps through the whole flowering season, that provides just an interesting plant shape and beauty through the season. And then other kinds of things we're looking at, obviously, are oil seed and oil content in the seed. And is it comparable to what we get in annual flax? Or maybe there's new compounds in there that would have health benefits for people. So, in addition to lowering cholesterol or things like that, maybe they do some other magic in humans, which of course would have a great market appeal. And we have several labs working on fiber as well. And we have a grant from the Minnesota legislature, the LCCMR grant, which is the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources. And that's funded a large group of people. We have about 25 people working on perennial flax, looking at all these traits, plus looking at pollinators, and whether or not these would be an interesting pollinator source, since it starts to flower here in Minnesota in early May, and it can flower past freezes in the fall. So like this last fall, we had it blooming in November after a hard freeze, and they were out blooming. And so it gives pollinators an additional length to the season for potential nectar feeding, pollen collection, and or maybe honey.
Sure. Wow, that sounds like a challenge to go from half of a day of blooming to 2 weeks. So what a challenge. I really admire the gumption on that. I like that a lot. So I'm going to ask an additional question here, because it just seems like flax seems to be like a really big passion project for you. So I am just curious, like, why flax of all the things that you could potentially breed, which I understand, like, some of it is, the funding and the job availability, but it seems like you've landed with a passion project. So what is it about flax that it just like lights that fire for you?
Well, I think it's the diversity of the uses for the crop. And how, because it's given us an opportunity to breed for both agronomic traits like oilseed and fiber, kind of traditional agronomic traits, as well as horticultural traits, cut flowers, herbaceous perennials, and then of course pollinators and ecosystem services kind of fall in the middle. And so it's one of those crops where I just get so excited about it, because it's like, think of the potential. Like you could have this perennial flax and it would do this, 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 and this, and think of the market value that would have, but more importantly, the benefits that it would have to humans. Bright blue colors. Wow. That gives you, it's good horticulture therapy. We always say, just lovely colors, makes you happy. So good against depression, a good antidepressant, a natural one, to having it as, cut flowers in vases or outside in your garden or in containers, color pots, etc. And then feeding you. I mean, like having flaxseed or grinding it up to make flax flour, or having, the oil extracted, that would have all these benefits. And then as well as, fiber to make linen with or something. Maybe we'll revive the linen industry a bit. And as well as, of course, just all the pollinator services that can come along. So, I mean, I just think it's one of those where it's like, it kind of fills all the needs that we have. And, one additional trait or set of traits that we're looking at too is drought and heat tolerance. So like we have fields of flax where we don't ever irrigate them. So it's only natural rain that falls in the summer, but otherwise, like last summer, we had extremely dry summer. I think you did Wisconsin as well. We were in a drought for a long time. And these fields were never irrigated, and yet they still flowered. We were able to harvest oil seed off from them, etc. And so they're very, very heat and drought tolerant, which, of course, in these modern days is an important set of traits to also have.
Sure. Yeah. What a super plant. That's very exciting.
We sure think so. We've sold it ourselves on it. That's for sure.
Yeah. I love that. I'm such a fan of what people are passionate about and learning about that. So thank you for indulging my bonus question.
Absolutely.
I have just 3 questions left because I suspect we could talk about this all day, and I don't want to take up your entire day. So first question is, if people want to learn more about any of the things that we've talked about today, where can they go?
Well, that's a good question. There are a few perennial flax cultivars on the market, so if they're interested in that, they could purchase them. So there are a few ornamental types available on the market, oftentimes called blue flax. You can buy a seed of them, sometimes seedlings. So check your local retailer, retail garden center, or big box store. Maybe they'll have some. And you could also go to, for instance, we have a website, kind of an organization called the Forever Green Initiative. And if you just search for Forever Green and flax, you'll come up with more information about it. And that website is forevergreen.umn.edu.
Perfect. We will have links to those in the show notes for sure. So then the next question is, if people want to take that next step to maybe get involved with flax in any of the ways we've talked about today. Obviously, you mentioned maybe purchasing some. But what else can they do to get involved with flax or flax research?
That's a great question. Well, one of the things we're looking for is farmers who are interested in producing perennial flax. And it could be under organic or conventional production methods. We're testing both of those methods as well. So they could let us know that potentially they're interested in trialing some. I mean, we already have a couple growers in the upper Midwest that are wanting to trial some this next year. So we're going to put some out there. And also, if home gardeners are interested in that, et cetera, sometimes there's options for citizen-supported science. So sometimes you can volunteer to, take data, collect data, and so forth on various, selections, et cetera. And so at some point, maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, we'll probably have some new releases that will be coming along, and we'd love to have some citizen scientists just recording winter-hardiness and how they perform for them wherever it is they're growing them.
Sure. Yeah. If anyone's interested in that, we'll have Neil's contact information in the show notes as well. And then the final question is, what is one fun fact that listeners wouldn't know if all they had was your research?
Well, there's lots of things about me. Of course, as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm a plant nerd. I've always wanted to know, the scientific names of plants and look at their ornamental value or their edible value or anything like that. I'm just kind of a plant geek for sure. But probably one fun fact nobody would know about me unless you know me really well is that all of my friends have diagnosed me with a canning disorder. So I grew up on a farm in Vermont, and we always preserved our fruits and vegetables via canning or freezing. And that's kind of stuck with me. So, like every summer throughout the growing season, I have to preserve things. And of course, they're great giveaway gifts to everyone, but it's always kind of rewarding in the winter to open up a jar of, whatever it might be. Maybe it's salsa, and savor it and think about, like, hey, we grew that, we preserved it, and there is a taste of last summer. I wonder what we'll have next summer. So I have a canning disorder.
Okay. Yeah, I have done fridge pickles with cucumbers. I've recently started doing a little bit. It's an easy start because canning is kind of scary. I'm not gonna lie. I'm very intimidated. So when people tell me that they're good at it, I'm always very impressed. I'm a little nervous to delve in further myself, but I got the pickles down.
Well, we could easily get you started, as someone with a disorder. So
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's clear that your passion for your work just shines through this entire conversation. So thank you so much for your time and all the hard work you're doing.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure talking about this wonderful crop, perennial flax. And everyone, I hope you get a chance to see it someday, the blue flowers, maybe fields of blue, or get a chance to grow it or eat it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Student Spotlight, where we highlight the work of graduate and undergraduate society student members. Today, we'll be talking to Dharani Suresh Babu. Welcome to the show. Can you start us off by introducing yourself and where you're studying?
Thank you, Obi, for having me on the show. Hello, everyone. I'm Dharani Suresh Babu from India, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD with major in horticulture science and minor in computer science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm also serving as a research assistant in the Department of Horticulture under Dr. Mura's supervision. I completed my bachelor's in agricultural information technology at Tamil Nadu Agricultural University from India and master's in environmental and conservation science at North Dakota State University from North Dakota. And subsequently, I worked with multiple international organizations. My career aspirations have always revolved around merging of agriculture and information technology, and I'm highly enthusiastic about their potential in revolutionizing the agriculture industry, and thus have structured my career accordingly. Indeed, I would like to express my gratitude to my family for their tremendous support in my profession.
Wonderful. And what are you currently researching?
My research focuses on using artificial intelligence techniques to enhance cranberry farming and to provide comprehensive solutions for cranberry growers, which is very fascinating for me. The first part of my research focuses on enhancing productivity by developing Raspberry Pi cameras and computer vision techniques, and this will enable growers to monitor cranberry growth stages continuously and to make data-driven decisions, which is very important. The second part of my research aims to detect different types of biotic and abiotic stresses in cranberry cultivation using hyperspectral, multispectral, and RGB sensors and drones, and this will allow growers to optimize their management strategies effectively. This also includes yield estimation. And currently, I'm working on the third part of my research, which focuses on maximizing profits for cranberry growers by developing an open source image analysis technique that accurately measures the amount of anthocyanin pigment in cranberries and identify the percentage of white and red color fruits. And this will help growers to determine the best time to harvest their crop for achieving maximum profit. Overall, this research will help cranberry growers to optimize their management strategies, prepare for unexpected environmental conditions, improve precision farming measures, and ultimately leading to better cranberry yields and profits. Certainly, I'm grateful to my advisor, Dr. Mura, for providing me with such an exciting project and for her great support and guidance.
Great. And if you could have your dream research project, what would that look like?
That's an interesting question. My short-term goal is to extend the application of AI technologies, the one I'm developing in my graduate research on cranberry, to other crops. My long-term goal is to create sustainable precision agricultural methods that are adaptable to any type of food crops to enhance crop production and most importantly, while preserving the soil health. I aim to make these techniques and approaches accessible to all growers, from small scale farmers to large scale farmers, and to encourage their adoption in farm practices. Also, I hope to inspire future generations to pursue career in agriculture and to promote a world where every child has access to adequate food, malnutrition is eradicated, poverty is reduced, and peace prevails. My ultimate goal is to establish a global hub that caters to the needs of all growers.
Awesome. Well, if you'd like to get in touch with Dharani about her work, we'll have her contact information in our show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, and best wishes on your future studies and career. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Abby, and thank you for having me on the show. Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below.